Minnesota welcomed Somali refugees starting in 1992. Jobs were plentiful, resettlement agencies were experienced, and word spread through Somali communities worldwide. Come to Minnesota. There's work, there's welcome, there's hope. 33 years later, Minnesota hosts approximately 108,000 Somali Americans, the largest concentration in the United States. But federal prosecutors have now charged 78 people in what they call the largest pandemic-era fraud in American history. $250 million stolen from programs meant to feed hungry children. The Treasury Department is investigating whether stolen millions reached al-shabab, the al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organization that recruited more than 40 young Americans from Minnesota's Somali community since 2007. In this video, we'll explore how Minnesota became America's Somali capital, examine the documented terrorist recruitment pipeline from Minneapolis, and investigate current fraud scandals linking taxpayer dollars to potential terrorism financing. We're examining Minnesota's crisis through three dimensions. First, the migration patterns that created America's largest Somali diaspora. Second, the terrorist recruitment pipeline that drew dozens of Somali Americans to fight for al-Shabab and ISIS. Third, the massive fraud investigations and their potential terror financing connections. We'll conclude by examining what this means for national security and community relations. The migration story. Why Minnesota? Somalia collapsed into civil war in 1991 after President Siad Barre's ouster. According to the United Nations, more than 1 million Somalis fled as refugees. The United States began issuing refugee visas in 1992. The Minnesota story began with a want ad. A Marshall, Minnesota poultry plant, 150 miles west of Minneapolis, advertised for workers. Somali men in South Dakota applied and were immediately hired. What happened next reveals how culture shaped migration. Somalis practice war, news sharing, and Sahan, pioneer scouting. Word spread fast. Somalis in San Diego heard about Marshall jobs, sent scouts, and confirmed the reports. Immediate hiring, steady paychecks, ability to send money to refugee camps in Kenya and Ethiopia. Between 2005 and 2018 alone, 13,582 Somali refugees resettled directly in Minnesota. Thousands more relocated from other states through secondary migration. They came for three reasons. First, established resettlement infrastructure through Lutheran social services, Catholic charities, and the International Institute of Minnesota, organizations experienced from helping Southeast Asian refugees in the 1970s. Second, accessible entry-level jobs requiring no English. Third, growing Somali community networks. By the mid-2000s, Minneapolis's Cedar Riverside became Little Mogadishu. More than 600 Somali-owned businesses emerged by 2006, representing $164 million to $494 million in purchasing power. This seemed like an American success story, until vulnerabilities beneath the surface attracted terrorist organizations. The recruitment pipeline. On March 11, 2009, FBI Director Robert Mueller testified before Congress with a disturbing revelation. This past October, the threat of homegrown terrorism took another disturbing turn when a young man from Minnesota carried out a suicide bombing in Somalia. This marked the first time a U.S. citizen had carried out a terrorist suicide bombing, and critically, the individual was radicalized in Minnesota. The bomber was Shirwa Ahmed, a 26-year-old naturalized citizen from Minneapolis. On October 29, 2008, Ahmed drove an explosive-laden truck into a Puntland Intelligence Service office in Bosaso, Somalia, killing approximately 20 people. But Ahmed wasn't alone. More than 20 young Somali Americans from Minneapolis had traveled to Somalia between 2007 and 2009 to fight for al-Shabab. Recruitment began around 2005, centered at the Abubakar as-Sadiq Islamic Center in Minneapolis. According to Justice Department documents, recruiters including Kabdullahi Ahmed Farex and Abdiweli Yassin Isse met young Somali men at a Minneapolis mosque in late 2007, encouraging them to fight in Somalia's war. Isse allegedly purchased airline tickets for those who agreed. The pitch worked on young men caught between two worlds. Recruiters promised purpose, brotherhood, and paradise for martyrdom. By 2009, federal prosecutors charged 14 people with recruitment and material support for al-shabab. More than 20 young Somalis were convicted on terrorism charges. The recruitment didn't stop. In 2013, al-Shabab released Minnesota's Martyrs, The Path to Paradise, a 40-minute propaganda video featuring 3 Twin Cities men. One recruit declared, "This is the real Disneyland. You need to come here and join us." A 2011 congressional report estimated approximately 40 Americans had joined al-Shabab. Then ISIS began recruiting Somali Minnesotans. A Department of Homeland Security report found Minnesota led the nation in Americans who joined or attempted to join ISIS. Community leader Abdirizak Bihi, who lost his nephew to al-Shabab, became an activist. "We and al-Shabab have one thing in common. We are competing for the hearts and minds of the young people," Bihi said. Most Somali Minnesotans condemned recruitment. Parents came to FBI offices in tears after children left for Somalia. But the pipeline revealed how small networks could exploit cultural connections and integration challenges to radicalize American citizens. The fraud investigations. In September 2022, federal prosecutors announced charges in what U.S. Attorney Andrew Luger called the largest pandemic-era fraud in the United States. Feeding Our Future, a non-profit founded in 2016, allegedly stole $250 million while claiming to distribute meals to schoolchildren during COVID-19. The scheme, Feeding Our Future, submitted fake meal count sheets and invoices. One falsified sheet claimed a small grocery store served 3,250 children twice daily during a single week. Between April 2020 and April 2021, that location claimed over 1.4 million meals served to children. 78 people have been charged, 57 convicted. Mastermind Amy Bock is white, but most defendants were Somali American. According to court documents, defendants spent stolen funds on Burberry and Louis Vuitton purchases, real estate, luxury vehicles, and international travel. They wired millions to banks in China and Somalia. But Feeding Our Future represents one case among many. Fox 9. Minneapolis documented daycare fraud leading to charges since 2015. By late 2025, Minnesota launched investigations into 14 separate Medicaid programs, including autism therapy, emergency housing, home health assistance, and disability supports. First Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson estimated fraud across all programs could total $1 billion. FBI Director Kash Patel said in January 2026, "The FBI believes this is just the tip of a very large iceberg." One program saw explosive growth. Minnesota's Integrated Community Supports Program cost $4.6 million annually in 2021. By 2025, it reached nearly $180 million. Fraudulent providers billed for services never provided, connected to at least one participant's death. Early investigations faced obstacles. When Minnesota's Department of Education found irregularities in Feeding Our Future's paperwork in 2020, the nonprofit sued, accusing the state of racial discrimination. A 2024 state auditor report found the threat of legal consequences and negative media attention affected regulatory decisions. Kayesh Magan, a Somali American fraud investigator at Minnesota's Attorney General's office, identified the uncomfortable truth. "We must grapple with something that is uncomfortable and true. Nearly all of the defendants in the cases I've listed are from my community." The al-Shabab connection. In December 2025, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced an investigation into whether Minnesota tax money reached al-Shabab. Treasury is examining funds sent from Minnesota to Somalia through money service businesses, informal hawala networks based on clan relationships. Glenn Kearns, a retired Seattle police detective who spent 14 years on a federal joint terrorism task force, investigated hawalas spanning Seattle to Minneapolis. Kearns discovered many people sending money through hawalas received DHS benefits. He investigated receiving hawalas in Somalia and determined significant funds reached al-shabab networks. Whether intended for the terror group or not, al-shabab was taking a cut. A former Minneapolis Joint Terrorism Task Force official stated, "Every scrap of economic activity, anywhere Somalis are concentrated, every cent sent back to Somalia benefits al-shabab in some way." One confidential source claimed, the largest funder of al-shabab is the Minnesota taxpayer. Context matters. Somalia receives approximately $1.7 billion in remittances annually from its diaspora, more than the Somali government's entire budget. An estimated 40% of Somali households receive remittances. These flows are legitimate and crucial for families in one of the world's poorest countries. But al-Shabab controls territory and has infiltrated financial networks. However, former US Attorney Andy Luger, who prosecuted Feeding Our Future until January 2025, told CBS News, "The vast majority of money went to luxury items. There was never evidence this money funded terrorism, nor was that the intent of the 70 people we indicted." A CBS News Court file review supports Luger's assessment. Defendants spent cash on cars, property, and luxury travel. Millions wired overseas went to banks in China and Somalia, but tracking ultimate recipients is extremely difficult. The Treasury investigation continues. In January 2026, Treasury imposed a geographic targeting order covering Hennepin and Ramsey counties, lowering reporting thresholds for international transfers to $3,000. FinCEN and IRS Criminal Investigation are examining whether financial institutions properly monitored transactions. This reveals a perfect storm: fraud networks, informal money transfers outside banking regulation, and an active terrorist organization receiving funds. Whether intentional terror financing occurred remains under investigation, but the vulnerability is clear. What happens next? 4 scenarios emerge. Option 1. Aggressive enforcement with systemic reform. Maintain investigations, prosecute all fraud cases, implement comprehensive program reforms including enhanced money service monitoring. The obstacle: overly aggressive enforcement could damage the social safety net while failing to distinguish criminal networks from the broader community. Option 2. Community-based prevention. Partner with Somali American organizations to prevent fraud at its roots, building on the model that addressed terrorist recruitment. The challenge: close social cohesion may have contributed to hesitancy in reporting fraud. Option 3. Targeted investigations with political consequences. Current approach combines enforcement with messaging. President Trump targeted Minnesota's Somali community, announcing an end to temporary protected status and describing the state as a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity. The risk: stigmatizing 108,000 people, most US citizens, could increase marginalization and potentially drive recruitment by extremist groups. Option 4. Status quo plus federal oversight. Maintain enhanced oversight without major policy changes, allowing prosecutions to proceed. The danger: without systemic reforms, new fraud networks could emerge. The most effective solution likely involves elements of all 4: continued prosecution, systemic reforms, genuine community partnership, and patience to distinguish criminal networks from the broader population. Conclusion: Minnesota welcomes Somali refugees with generous programs and opportunities. After examining settlement history driven by jobs and family networks, the proven recruitment pipeline that radicalized more than 40 Americans, and massive fraud investigations resulting in 78 charges, with ongoing Treasury investigations into potential terror financing, generosity created vulnerabilities that criminal and extremist networks exploited. Minnesota's Somali community isn't defined by fraud and terrorism. The vast majority are law-abiding citizens. Representative Ilhan Omar became the first Somali American elected to Congress in 2018. Somali Americans serve in government, own successful businesses, and built vibrant cultural institutions. But documented cases reveal how small criminal networks exploit community cohesion, overwhelm regulatory systems, and potentially channel taxpayer dollars to America's enemies. This represents a test case for refugee resettlement nationwide. Minnesota's experience shows generosity without oversight creates exploitation opportunities. Community connections that help refugees integrate can be weaponized by those with criminal or extremist intent. Accusations of discrimination, whether legitimate or weaponized, can freeze enforcement until problems metastasize. The question isn't whether Minnesota should have welcomed Somali refugees. It's whether America can design programs resilient enough to serve vulnerable populations without becoming fraud targets, and whether we can maintain security without stigmatizing entire communities for crimes of a few. But what do you think? Should authorities prioritize prosecution and enforcement, or focus on community partnership and prevention? Do the fraud investigations represent systemic failure in oversight, or something deeper about refugee integration challenges? Subscribe for more in-depth analysis, detailed investigations, and comprehensive reporting on national security issues, immigration policy, and the complex intersection of community integration and homeland security.